From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Lebanon 1 year on from the Beirut port explosion. The devastating blast on August 4th, 2020, caused by the ignition of a massive cache of improperly stored, highly explosive ammonium nitrate at the Beirut port, killed more than 200 people, wounded 6,500, left hundreds of thousands homeless, and did billions of dollars worth of damage to the city. To discuss the investigation into the blast, and the quest for justice, the reconstruction process, and the political, economic, and social impact, we're joined today by three great guests: Chris Abi-Nassif, Mona Fawaz, and Aya Majzoub. Chris is the head of MEI's Lebanon program. Mona is a professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut, the co-founder of AUB's Beirut Urban Lab, director of the Social Justice in the City Research Program at AUB's Issam Ferez Institute of Public Policy, and a non-resident scholar with MEI's Lebanon program. Aya is the Lebanon and Bahrain researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. Chris, Mona, Aya, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much.
Chris, let's start off with you. Can you give our listeners a kind of quick overview of where things stand 1 year after the Beirut port explosion?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a nutshell, really, Lebanon right now, a year on, is witnessing this fight for justice, really, in a nutshell. It's a fight against the political establishment's notorious impunity that has really plagued the country for years and decades. On the accountability and justice fronts, to really start with, I think that's kind of one of the main buckets of where we stand today. This year was really plagued by attempts by Lebanon's political parties to delay and to try to derail really the investigations that are being conducted right now, and by leveraging effectively the parliamentary immunities that MPs in Lebanon actually benefit from to try to block some of the convocations and the summonings that the lead investigator in the case of Lebanon has tried to effectively bring about. And when I say some political parties, effectively it's parties such as Hezbollah, such as Amal, which is led by the Speaker of the House, such as the Future Movement, which is led by former Prime Minister Hariri. So there's this kind of area of impunity, and there is this lack of accountability, and MPs, effectively politicians, trying to block everything that's happening. But also on the flip side of that coin, you really have the families of the victims. You have a lot of the alternative political parties that have been growing over the past couple of years, really trying to increasingly mobilize to try to demand accountability, to try to increase the pressure on these establishment parties in a way to let the criminal investigation actually take its course. So you have Judge Tariq Bitar, who's leading these investigations, and he seems to have the credibility really that's necessary and needed, as well as the full support of the victim's family to lead that charge while searching for justice. On the reconstruction front, and I'm sure that Mona will discuss a lot of that as well, really, we have seen a lot of funding pouring in the weeks and months afterwards. You've had a lot of NGOs, domestic and international, really mobilized to support. You mentioned the hundreds of thousands of people really who lost their houses. And the reconstruction effectively of the port's surroundings, right, Mankhayl, Jammaizeh, Shafiyah, but also really the entire areas around it, has started picking up. It's nowhere near where it was before the port explosion, obviously, but it has picked up. And then on the port front, though, we do have more of a lag where, reconstruction is really pending a new government, even though there is a lot of interest that has been flagged by parties such as the French, the Germans, etc., to be engaged in that port reconstruction. But nothing has yet happened a year afterwards in terms of kind of reconstructing the port, which is one of the largest on the Eastern Mediterranean. And then one last point I would make on the humanitarian, the human front, really, which is of the essence of where we stand today. Needless to say, terrible psychological and emotional scarring that took place. PTSD is really a daily reality for many citizens, not only in Beirut, but all over Lebanon, be it from the port, but also because of all of these converging crises that are hitting the country. That mental health component is not addressed, although it's a massive factor, right? And you're having a lot of people expressing willingness to leave the country, and that has massive implications on the brain drain, on the future of where this country is headed, really. So yeah, in a nutshell, be it by negligence or by the pre-planned act of sabotage, really, we don't know where it stands right now. But this Beirut port explosion really has massive ramifications on the day-to-day life of everyday citizens at this stage, even a year in.
Building on what Chris just said about the investigation process, what has that uncovered so far, and what have been the kind of main roadblocks?
In short, the official investigation has uncovered nothing so far, at least publicly. we haven't been given any results or any answers yet. So we, the public and the families of the victims, still don't know why the ammonium nitrate came to Lebanon, why it stayed in the port for so long, who was responsible for keeping it in the port for so long, and then what triggered the explosion itself on August the 4th. The investigation is being conducted in complete secrecy. Now, we understand that some information can't be made public before the investigation is complete, but there's absolutely no reason for the public not to be continually appraised of the progress in the investigation, including things like how many people have been questioned, who is yet to be questioned, and the general issues that the investigator is looking into. Instead, we and the public and the families of the victims have had to rely on media leaks to get information about the progress of the investigation, and some of these media leaks have been inaccurate. But apart from the secrecy with which the investigation is being conducted and the complete lack of transparency, we have three main concerns about the ongoing domestic investigation. The first is the structure of the court, which is handling this investigation. The government referred the case to an exceptional court called the Judicial Council, and this Judicial Council fails to meet basic international fair trial standards. So for cases referred to this court, the Justice Minister appoints the judicial investigator who leads the investigation. By law, there's only one judicial investigator. So you have basically a one-man show running the entire investigation into one of the biggest crimes in Lebanon's history. Further, neither his decisions are subject to appeal, nor are the decisions of the Judicial Council, where the case will be then referred to for trial. And this lack of appeal is a very big violation of international fair trial standards. And it's even more concerning given the documented lack of the judiciary's independence that we and many others have been researching and campaigning against for years. The second major concern that we have is around the due process violations that we've been documenting in the investigation. As you may know, 25 people were detained in August and September of last year, and only 8 have been recently released. But these individuals, with the exception of the head of the Port Authority and the head of the Customs Administration, are relatively low-level customs, port, and security officials. The detained don't know the specific charges against them or the evidence against them. They haven't been able to meet with their lawyers in private without the presence of guards, and they seem to be held in detention indefinitely. And these are powers granted to the judicial investigator, but which also, of course, violate international fair trial and due process standards. And then the third, probably main issue that we have around the investigation is this issue of immunities and the political interference resulting in the investigation from trying to navigate and remove these immunities. So under Lebanese law, ministers and parliamentarians have immunity from prosecution by the regular judiciary, and judges need to obtain approval from relevant ministries to be able to prosecute state employees such as the head of security agencies. The last judge, Judge Sawan, had already charged some politicians, and a couple of the politicians that he had charged filed a case against him, which caused him to be replaced. Now the new judicial investigator is operating within the same prosecutorial limits, but instead of jumping in to charge these politicians and state officials, he's requested that the relevant entities lift the immunity of these officials first and allow him to prosecute them. But as you can imagine, the political class is now using every tool at its disposal to obstruct and delay the judge's requests to lift immunity. And this is where we are today. But what's completely outrageous and ludicrous is that without the same people accused in this case of lifting their own immunity, the judge can't move forward with the charges against them.
Mona, turning to the issue of reconstruction, from an urban planning perspective, how do you build back after something like this? Surely it must be a massive undertaking. How does that work? Who pays for it? Who designs it? Can you just speak a little bit about the kind of reconstruction angle?
Yeah, of course. So, as you know, the first thing to think about when you look at the port and its location in the city, for those who are not familiar with Beirut, is to remember that Beirut historically grew around that port. Its economy, its homes, its spaces all developed in the areas immediately adjacent to the port and around it. So, these are the old neighborhoods, these are the heritage neighborhoods built with often material like sandstone that is very sensitive to explosions and that could not sustain the blast. So the damage was massive, in part because these are historical districts that were really fragile. And that repercussion is important to consider when you look 1 year later what has happened, because it's not simply that we are finding the funding to recover a city and reverse the issue because the disaster happened, as it happens usually, like when you teach students about what happens in Katrina or what happens in other contexts like the Mexico earthquake. You have a disaster and then you have a setup that's put in place to repair the city. In this case, you're actually in full disaster recovery. I like to say we are not in a post-disaster, but we are in an in-disaster recovery. So there's the overlapping effects of the financial crisis, the political crisis, the health crisis that are all overlapping with the need to repair the homes. And consequently, people are having to make very hard choices between cash and compensations, which they don't really know how they receive them because the entire framework of recovery is very murky and it's a lengthy discussion, but there's very little transparency about it. But once people get these compensations, they have to make very tough choices between getting the meds they need, if they find them, of course, repairing their homes, or simply feeding their kids. And these kinds of decisions, when they're having to make them every day, are pushing them away from the homes they used to live and really stalling the possibility of having the most important ingredient of a post-disaster recovery happen, which is city dwellers being able to be involved in a discussion on how is repair happening, what role can I play, how can we come back together as a community to recover our neighborhoods. So it's in this context that you see how huge the challenge is of the post-disaster recovery. We often think that you secure funding, money flows in, and then windows are repaired. If there's a structural damage, you fix it. But when the money is lacking, when gradually the building materials are lacking today, you see that for people, there's a huge disempowerment. And then, of course, also for the institutions and the agencies that are trying to support the process of repair, the challenges are major. The second point that is important to think about is the context in which this repair is happening. So the setup that was put in place for fixing the homes, recovering the neighborhoods, is very much a humanitarian setup. The state of Lebanon played very little role. It issued a law in September 2020, the Post-Disaster Recovery Law 194, which is a law that lacks any mechanism for supporting the processes of repair and simply limits the role of public agencies to channeling the funding to NGOs that would basically, local and international, that would basically fix the houses. And consequently, it threw the entire task of repair on civil society, what's called civil society, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations. And the international community followed suit, sort of doing exactly the same process that we had seen with the Syrian refugee crisis response. They transposed the response of the Syrian refugee crisis on the neighborhoods of the blast, divided them in area the same ways they do with post-disaster recoveries elsewhere, and began to repair neighborhoods one at a time, allocating areas without any public state involvement to international organizations or large-scale local organizations that would fix the houses. So it's as if the institutional setup that's put in place does not include a place for a Lebanese state, for public agencies, a housing agency, the post-disaster agency that actually exists in Lebanon. And of course, the agencies did not play their role. And when you look at this general setup, this is exactly what you know is a recipe for failure, because no post-disaster recovery is successful without having a public custodian of the common good that's actually taking charge and coordinating the process, the private sector being channeled with its capability, nonprofit, and residents. And in this case, we see that the most direly missing actor is the public agencies that would be playing this role of coordination. When a little bit too late, a public actor entered, it was the Lebanese army with its forward forward emergency room. That again is undesirable. These are neighborhoods that have vulnerable communities, the refugees. You do not want to militarize the process of post-disaster recovery. You want it to be a process of people coming together and coordinating that repair. And instead, this is delegated to the army, and that's very counterproductive, no matter what the intention of the army and that unit were. So on these two fronts, we see that both institutionally and in terms of processes set on the ground, there was a recipe for disaster. And honestly, although we see today a little bit of life coming back on the streets, when you look deep into the life of the neighborhoods, who's come back, what are the businesses that are really reopening, how much can we talk about a local economy that has been set back in place, we find that actually a lot of the ingredients that would give us hope that this is a recovery and not simply people trying to patch a few things to be able to come back to their homes or to their businesses. These ingredients are actually missing. And so without wanting to be too alarmist, there certainly is a need to set in place something completely different. And that is the actual challenge of the post-disaster recovery. It's not any different from what we talk about in the political process. It's that it requires a reinvention of the entire setup through which the city is being designed, planned, rebuilt. For the last 30 years, and that's the last point I'll make, for the last 30 years, Beirut has been used as mere land to attract capital into Lebanon, and its homes, its houses, including those areas in the blast area, were not given an active role in the local economy in which they could support everyday life in terms of places for livelihood or places for businesses or etc. Instead, these neighborhoods were really used to sort of encourage real estate speculation and attract foreign capital into Lebanon so that the balance of payment can, quote unquote, be supposedly positive. The problem with that is that the economic role of the city was removed from the city, and instead a lot of the houses became empty, used simply to store capital. And so today what is needed for a recovery, a true recovery, is a reinvention of the role of the city, a reinvention of the role of these neighborhoods, both institutionally in invigorating the role of residents and empowering them to be able to live in their neighborhoods, and second, spatially by changing the regulatory framework that organizes these areas so that we shift the economy from a rentier economy that is attracting capital to one of allowing neighborhoods to play their actual economic role as productive areas. And these are huge challenges, but they are the only way forward if we really want to think about a true recovery.
Chris, shifting back to the political side of the equation, what have been the long-term ramifications of the explosion for Lebanon's political establishment?
Well, Aya touched upon some of the questions really that are at the center stage of the investigation, right? In terms of who brought the ammonium nitrate, who knew about it, and then finally, what was the trigger really that led to the explosion? And if you think about it, the political establishment, just broadly speaking, is in deep trouble. And this cover-up mentality that is being adopted by these players is really not helping, because someone somewhere was implicated. Someone somewhere knew about that ammonium nitrate, and then someone somewhere either covered it up or just totally disregarded what was happening from the minute that ammonium entered the Beirut port back in 2013 up until now. So you effectively have this chain of responsibility that spans multiple administrations and where multiple parties were in charge, really. So politically speaking, and even if you kind of look back when the October 2019 protest movement started, when the massive financial collapse hit us and is still hitting Lebanon, really, that started eroding the political capital of all establishment parties. And, I say all because at the end of the day, it's not really a zero-sum game where, some win and some lose. We're in a situation where all parties effectively have lost in the fight for Lebanese public opinion, maybe some, less than others, but across the board, everyone has lost. And so you have this port explosion that comes in, and then the fiasco, the impunity fiasco that came afterwards, right? So you can imagine then what happened and continues to happen to the political capital of the political establishment. And, most importantly, when not that, when the Beirut port blast happened alone, but also when nothing happened afterwards, right? Which is often as, if not more important, in the quest for justice and accountability. So the members of parliament who are currently blocking really the lifting of immunities have been labeled on social media and even in mainstream media. They've been labeled ammonium MPs. And these MPs are trying to exonerate themselves or their own fellow MPs from the general liability. And this has not gone unnoticed really by the general public, which is why overall on this political trend, it's a downward trend where people actually are aware. This time is different than other times because of the size, the magnitude, and really the scarring impact that this explosion has had. And then the final point I would make, and although that's really still around 8 months away, elections are coming up, and this will effectively be a forum at the end of the day for the Lebanese people to try to sanction or penalize all those who effectively stood against this drive towards accountability and justice. So the political future, or at least to be realistic, at least the size of the representation of many of these parties who are blocking that investigation can and I believe will be influenced by their stance on the ongoing investigation.
Digging into the issue of Lebanon's climate of impunity in more detail, you spoke earlier about the prosecutorial limits in the investigation, the absurdity of asking officials to, in effect, approve lifting of their own immunity. How do you get around that? Do you think elections are the way forward, like Chris suggested? Is there any other way to get real accountability under the current system?
I mean, elections are definitely one very important vehicle to drive political change. But I also think that we have to be very realistic. The electoral law, the system is rigged in favor of these political parties. You have an electoral law that privileges these larger parties over the smaller, more nascent civil society groups that are starting to form parties. But I think it's, we can't also discount the impact that the economic crisis will have on the ability of these establishment parties to buy votes and to perpetuate their systems of patronage. So whereas before in previous elections, they, would have had to, give somebody a job or pay for somebody's education in order to get their vote, what they have to do now is give food baskets. So the price of buying somebody's vote is much, much lower today in the middle of this devastating economic crisis than it was a few years before. I think some of the new groups have been really changing the way that politics is done, changing the way that grassroots campaigning is done in the country, and this hasn't gone unnoticed. But I also think that we should keep our expectations realistic in terms of what kind of gains these new parties will be able to make in the elections given this current system. And that's also assuming that elections do happen on time. But I think, what's really interesting to me is seeing people start to organize along their, along interest-based groups. So we've had really important mobilization from various syndicates and unions. We had a huge victory for the independents in the recent engineering syndicate. We've had before that a victory in the lawyers syndicate. So we're starting to see, people organize along their interest lines in a way that also signals their rejection of the ongoing system and their mobilization to demand something better. So we've yet to see the impact that this will have on politics manifest in the next several months and years. But to me, this is a very interesting phenomenon. But going back to this issue of the culture of impunity and the lack of accountability in this current system, I mean, you have a political class that has essentially impoverished the country over decades while enriching itself. And this is really manifest in what Lebanon has become today. We don't have any medicine, we don't have fuel, we don't have electricity, there are no functioning traffic lights. People's savings are trapped in the bank. We have hyperinflation and an economic crisis that's one of the worst in recent history, as per the World Bank. And yet these politicians are still horse trading over cabinet positions and who's going to be the new prime minister and how they're going to divide the spoils in the pie in a way that's completely disconnected from the concerns of ordinary people. And so, it's been very interesting to watch the way that people have mobilized around the Beirut blast. And this mobilization has been primarily led by the families of the victims themselves in saying that this time is not like the other times. Yes, we have never had accountability for corruption in Lebanon. We haven't had accountability for any of the political assassinations that have happened in the country since 2005. We haven't had accountability for torture, for excessive use of force by security forces during the protests. But this time will be different. The scale of the crime this time is different. And the families of the victims and civil society in Lebanon are all united in saying that this time will not be like all of the other times. And this time we will fight tooth and nail for accountability. And we're really seeing this play out in how much attention people are paying to the domestic investigation into the blast, and how much attention people are paying to this issue of immunities and lifting immunities. I mean, a few years ago, who knew that there was even, immunities for high-level politicians, let alone the types of immunities and the process required in order to lift this immunity. So it's really been very, energizing to watch the families of the victims and civil society groups be really leading the charge in demanding accountability, educating the public around the way that the system is designed in order to protect these high-level officials, and then leading the fight to start dismantling these immunities and paving the way for accountability for this Beirut blast, but also down the line for other grave human rights issues and corruption.
Well, I wanted to get your thoughts on this elections and mobilization piece that I was just speaking about as well. Do you think the push for accountability and anti-impunity activism can be a rallying point for the various alternative parties?
Yes, I think Aya has superbly summarized the main issues. I would say that the most important change that we have seen since the end of the civil war, because we have to remember that the Lebanese civil war ended with a general amnesty, that the political actors who were involved in the civil war, the militiamen, actually granted themselves. They came back to the country with businessmen partners, and together they set in place the economic system, the political system of impunity that has brought us to where we are today. So the impunity is really very old, and it's a very ingrained culture. I remember as a 17-year-old when the Lebanese civil war ended in the 1990s saying, how come we don't have the same thing that's happening in South Africa? Why don't we have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee? Why is there no accountability? And people were so exhausted. They just wanted us to turn the page. They would roll their eyes. So there was no sentiment that you wanted to do anything other than turn the page. And what's changed since at least 2015 very clearly in the country, in the mood, I can see it particularly with my students, is a sense that they're interested in knowing and a sense of agency, that you can't let anymore the management of the country, its transformation, be delegated to that same group of people who really brought us where we are. And gradually, more and more young people are not seeing anymore the word politics to mean something dirty, but actually to mean something that they really want to be engaged with so that they can make a difference. And until the last couple of months, where I think there is, and we should not discount it, an enormous weight of the financial meltdown, that and a very difficult everyday life. We just saw it now with electricity going, with no meds. That's really pushing a lot of people to feel that just for the sake of their families, they need to find a job elsewhere. And there's a very large number of young people who are leaving the country, and that's huge in our ability to mobilize or not. But until that moment, you could really feel that mobilization deeply, and everyone feeling that sense of responsibility, that I want to be involved, I can make a change. At the Syndicate of Engineers and Architects, I also just mentioned this, the recent win is an important one. So what you saw is a landslide in a syndicate that traditionally was managed by political parties who take turn in who will win the elections, who will be part of the council, how it will happen, so that many people stopped voting because it was simply hopeless. In the last elections, in particularly that time, there's a total change of tide. This time, 72% of the votes went to the independents. That includes the majority on the council of the syndicate. This has never happened before. The symbolic importance of this is that you had many new voters coming in and actually being engaged over a full year, negotiating their differences and reaching a platform that they felt confident to run with, even if they didn't agree fully with each other. So that is sort of to go more into the micro detail of how things are being organized, to say, yes, there is clearly a change that is happening. There's clearly mobilization that's happening. And that if the financial meltdown doesn't put us in a situation where people feel simply unable to continue to play that active role, that it will go on. And that extends, of course, beyond the order of engineers. The kind of effort that actors, professionals have exerted in the last year to inform people about what are the details of the financial meltdown, what are the issues about the post-disaster reconstruction, and more recently, how do we render the political class accountable? How do we create an independent judiciary? A very large number of Lebanese citizens now are paying close attention to these issues, and that will definitely be critical for a change in the course of things. Without also, as Chris said, being more optimistic than I should, I would say that it's the first time in 30 years that I genuinely feel people at least taking a huge distance from political parties and being invested in learning themselves and forming an opinion.
Aya, we're running a bit short on time, but I wanted to touch on the role of the international community here as well. A few weeks ago, a number of Lebanese and international organizations, individuals, survivors, and families of the victims wrote a letter to the UN Human Rights Council calling for an international investigative mission into the blast. Why is that important? What's it trying to achieve? And are you worried about any potential drawbacks associated with the international community stepping in here?
So I'll start by describing what we're asking for. So the UN mandated commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions are increasingly being used by the international community to respond to situations of serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, whether resulting from protracted events such as wars or resulting from sudden events, as is the case with this explosion. And since 2006, the Human Rights Council has authorized at least 34 such investigative bodies. And one of those bodies was actually authorized after the 2006 Israel war in Lebanon, where this body mandated by the Human Rights Council came to Lebanon to investigate crimes committed by the Israeli forces in Lebanon. And the mechanism that this works by is that one state or a group of states puts forward a resolution establishing this fact-finding mission or investigative body to the Human Rights Council. Any state, even if they're not a member of the Human Rights Council, can put forward this resolution. But then only the 47 members of the Human Rights Council can vote on this resolution. So we're now in the process of doing advocacy with the international community to convince them that what happened in Lebanon and resulted in the Beirut blast was not just a case of negligence by low-level state employees. It was the state failing to abide by its international obligations to respect the right to life of its residents. We're framing the issue with a human rights lens. That's number one. And then the other thing that we're trying to do is really to show that there is grassroots support from amongst the families of the victims and civil society in Lebanon for such a call. And that really is what motivated organizing this joint statement that we released a few weeks ago. Now, why is it important? We've discussed really all of the problems with the domestic investigation, including the limits that have been set on the investigation by the political class, the political interference, this issue of immunity, the pressures that this one judge is under. I can't imagine the kind of pressure that he must be under. Yesterday, we heard from one of the families of the victims that they've started receiving threats from some individuals on some sides for daring to call for immunity to be lifted and for daring to escalate their response to this lack of results from the domestic investigation. So you can just imagine the type of pressure that this one judge is operating under. So we thought it was really important for there to be an international investigation working with a judge that can, to a greater extent, immunize the investigation from political interference and pressure, but also provide the judge in Lebanon with the technical expertise necessary to conduct an investigation of this size, this magnitude, and this importance. And such an international investigative body, because they're not a prosecutorial authority, they're not bound by the same limits that the domestic investigation is bound by, as in they don't have to abide by this principle of immunities, because they're not prosecuting anyone. They're just building a narrative of what happened, who was responsible, and then most importantly, how did the Lebanese state in itself violate the human rights of the population, and what an effective remedy could look like, and what measures the state should adopt in order to ensure that something like this never happens again. Now, what is the purpose, or how can this then results or reports from the UN fact-finding mission be used? It can be used in one of three ways, or ideally all three ways. One is it's turned over then to the Lebanese authorities for domestic accountability. So here we still need to wage the battles around immunity and the independence of the judiciary. But when the truth is already out, when a UN body has identified who is responsible without being restricted by this web of immunities and interference, then it aids the judge and it aids the public and it aids the families of victims in then demanding that these immunities be dropped. Because what's happening now is, even before going for their investigation, a lot of these ministers who are charged are claiming that the charges against them are political, and they're trying to cast doubt on the impartiality and the legitimacy and the competence of the judge. So they're really muddying the waters around, the truth and around the historical narrative. And if they don't appear for investigation, then it's a big missing part of the puzzle. So, with historical narrative, with the truth set out by a UN fact-finding mission, I think we'll have more pressure that we can bring to bear on the establishment for dropping the immunities of people that the investigation found to be responsible. That's number one. Number two is such an investigation, or the results of the investigation, can be used in the domestic prosecutions in third countries. So, for example, there are currently at least two investigations criminal cases that we know of in France and Germany, because dual nationals or their nationals were killed in the explosion. And we know that some groups are preparing to launch more of these cases in other jurisdictions where dual nationals were impacted by the blast. Usually the case in these countries, a lot of them don't have the resources to investigate themselves. And so they are waiting for the results of the Lebanese investigation in order to then start their prosecutions. So we asked some of these countries whether a report by a UN body could be used in lieu of the results of a Lebanese investigation, and they said that yes. So they would be able to use it for their prosecutions. And because those cases are criminal cases, they could result in international arrest warrants being issued for Lebanese officials or any officials found to be responsible for the blast. That's two. And then finally, what we're really calling for also is that the results of such a fact-finding mission be then used to impose targeted human rights and corruption sanctions against those officials found to be responsible for the blast. Sanctions are one of the few tools that the international community has at its disposal to hold officials accountable for violations of human rights and for corruption. And in the context of Lebanon, it seems that only targeted sanctions that impact the personal wealth of these politicians and their ability to continue living the way that they do, only those types of sanctions seem able to really push them to change their behavior or to sideline them to allow a new generation of leaders to emerge in the country.
Great. We've covered a lot of ground in today's discussion, but before we wrap up, I want to get all of your thoughts briefly on where things go from here, what else can and should be done, and how the international community can help support the quest for justice. Let's start with you, Mona, and then you, Aya, and then conclude with you, Chris.
All right, so I'll just say quickly that from my perspective as an urbanist, the most important next step is to really shift from the humanitarian, which is about fixing homes and helping very poor people in a charity framework, towards a developmental framework that support local SMEs, for example, particularly those invested in green energy and a green economy, so that we can begin to see the neighborhoods and more generally the country set a new path of an economic development that's different from what we've seen in the last years. The real danger is with some of the projects being proposed in the city for the city and particularly for the port by the international community, is to perpetuate that high real estate rentier kind of model that dominated the last 30 years. That will be devastating for all of us. And it's consequently really important to be thinking about the explosion as a moment of awakening, of realizing that that entire model and the role for Lebanese citizens and their city to play in it since 1990 has been not only unsustainable, but simply unviable, and that we really need to consider and put in place a different way of both approaching the recovery and the future development. And that is absolutely necessary if we're going to have accountability. You cannot have accountability with people who are hungry and who need to be given a basket of food. So that productivity is critical for a proper functional political system.
How about you, Aya?
I won't dwell on it very much because I think I covered it in my previous answer, but we're really asking for the international community to establish a UN fact-finding mission into the Beirut blast, heeding the calls of Lebanese civil society and the families of the victims, and also to begin seriously building sanctions cases against those officials implicated in human rights abuses and corruption.
Chris, you've got the last word.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So what I'll end with actually is, again, reemphasizing this notion that, if the people who either perpetrated or, by sheer incompetence and negligence failed to prevent what happened in Beirut last August, if these people really managed to get away with what they did or failed to do, then this is really the biggest signaling to Lebanon's political class that they can get away with literally anything at this stage. And so if this crime goes unpunished and this messaging goes to, the Lebanese people, but most importantly, the international community, if this crime goes unpunished, then it's safe to say that we should forget collectively about seeking justice and finding truth. And that really applies to issues ranging from the forensic audit of the central bank that is of the essence at this stage, but also in other public administrations to really the smallest of violations. So if this goes unpunished, so will everything else. That's why really I think that the only way forward in that case is for sustained pressure by Lebanon's public opinion, but also by civil society organizations and both local and international NGOs. And then finally, perhaps more importantly, by the international community itself, because this is a fight really that the Lebanese political establishment cannot and should not win. We've seen mobilizations on the ground that are translating into political movements. We've seen world governments really share information and resources to support this ongoing investigation. So that needs to continue being leveraged. And then, I think it's sometimes easy to underestimate how much of a permanent shock this blast was, right? It's not an event that was suspended in time in many ways. It happens that we're commemorating it a year after, but it's really an everyday fight that all Lebanese are and, will continue to wage in the weeks, months, years ahead, no matter how long it takes.
We'll have to leave things there for now on that somber note. But Chris, Mona, Aya, thank you all for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.